Okay, so the next major theme that comes up in the first section, after a brief part of the section that we're skipping because it's not actually crucial to what we need to get from this text, Kant goes into the notion of duty. And duty is important to his argument here because he needs to tell us more about what the content of the goodwill is. So far, we have a description about how important the goodwill is for goodness in general, okay, because there's nothing in the world that's good without qualification except for a goodwill, according to the first sentence of this book of Kant's. So far he's told us that, but he hasn't told us what the goodwill is like. He hasn't given us any guidance about what the goodness of the will consists in. And so now he's going to give us more details about that content of the goodwill. How do we tell whether or not our will is good? And he describes what he's doing in exactly this way. He says, we have then to develop the notion of a will, i.e. the good will, which deserves to be highly esteemed for itself and is good without a view to anything further. Okay, so again, we need to know what the content of this goodwill is, and which, in estimating the value of our actions, always takes the first place and constitutes the condition of all the rest. So that's the thing he's described up to this point. And he's just saying we have to develop this notion, meaning we have to say more about what it involves. In order to do this, he writes, we will take the notion of duty, which includes that of a goodwill, although implying certain subjective restrictions and hindrances. So we're going to come back to the significance of that duty includes both the idea of a goodwill and also subjective restrictions and hindrances. But for now, what's most important about duty is that it does include this idea of a goodwill. So Kant's idea is if we can get clear about what's going on with duty, about how duty works, then that will clarify for us also what is going on with the goodwill, that is, how the goodwill works or what makes a will good. And let me remind you as well that at this point, this first section of the book, Kant has already advertised by the title of this section and some things that he says in the introduction that we haven't read, that he's starting from kinds of everyday notions. So this notion of duty is a kind of everyday notion, something that we use with even before we start doing ethics and start reflecting on what are the principles that should guide our actions. We still make use to the idea of duty, or another word for duty is obligation. Okay, so we have a sense of when we're obligated to behave in certain ways, when it's the right thing to do to behave in certain ways. Okay, and so that is what he wants to clarify now. So he's going to look at some examples of duty, and that's going to help to clarify what makes the will good when it is good. So Kant considers four kinds of cases here. He at least distinguishes four kinds of cases in the way that he talks about this. And then he looks at some examples that help him to make clear what duty is, okay, and how duty works. So the four kinds of cases he considers are, first, actions that are contrary to duty, and then second, actions that are consistent with duty, to which the agent also has an inclination. That is, so in the first case, actions that are contrary to duty, Kant says we can basically just put those off to the side and not consider them any further, because if we want to understand what duty is, then looking at actions that are contrary to duty is not going to tell us about what duty is, right? Those actions just break with what someone's obligations are, and so they're not going to tell us about what it is to act in accordance with obligations. The second example, where someone acts consistently with duty or consistently with their obligations, okay, but one where they also have an inclination. This is one that Kant is also going to eventually say is not going to help us clarify what duty itself is. Because, okay, people may act in a way that is consistent with their obligations, but are they acting because they're trying to meet their obligations, or are they rather acting because they have an inclination to behave in that way? So inclination in Kant's terminology basically just means any kind of desire or any kind of basically any kind of motive that leads one to want something or to pursue something other than a moral motive, okay? So we're going to look at some examples of that in just a moment. And then the final case is one of acting consistently with duty to which the agent has a contrary inclination. These are cases where we act according to what we ought to do, but we're acting in accordance with what we ought to do, contrary to something that we want to do. Okay, so these are cases where we want to do one thing, but we behave differently because we believe we have an obligation to behave a certain way. So now I realize that's a slightly abstract description. I apologize for that, but let's look at some of Kant's own examples. So the first example is of a shopkeeper, okay? So it's a matter of duty that a seller not overcharge an inexperienced customer. At least in Kant's presentation, that is an obligation that shopkeepers have. So the idea here is if a child goes into the shop to buy an apple, the shopkeeper doesn't say that'll be $5 just because it's a child and they don't know how much an apple should cost, right? They charge the same amount to everybody because it's the fair price, and it's just fair to treat everybody the same and give them the same price, okay? So Kant thinks that's a matter of duty for shopkeepers. We might disagree, but that doesn't matter that much. What's important is that this is supposed to be an example that it's just a kind of everyday example of something that you could say is a duty and somebody acting in accordance with that duty. If you don't like this example, it's possible to come up with others relatively easily. But the problem here is that a lot of merchants would have an indirect motive not to overcharge their customers. In other words, or in particular, they might say that it's good business practice. They don't want to overcharge a child for an apple because then word might get out that they take advantages of children in the way that they price their products, okay? So they give a consistent price to everybody because that's good business practice. Another benefit of that is everybody knows, and if they communicate about what the prices are, you know, on the street, so to speak, then people know how much things are at that store, and they come in, they get the same price as anybody else, okay? So you can imagine a shop owner saying, you know, I charge my customers a fair price because it's a good business practice and I know they'll come back and shop here more often, okay? So Kant says, well, that's fine, that's a perfectly fine motivation to have, but it's not a moral motivation. It's not a motivation that's based on a sense of obligation to the customers or a sense of obligation about what one's duties are as a shop owner, okay? And so it's going to be hard, since there is that possibility of this other motive about good business practices, and, you know, in other words, practices that are going to be more lucrative for the business, are going to bring in more revenue, because there's that other inclination to charge the fair price. It's hard to tell whether or not this action, which is in accordance with duty, is actually done from a concern for duty, okay, or is done because it's the person's duty to do it. So let's look at another example. We haven't yet found an example that really works to clarify what duty is according to Kant. So let's look at another example. Kant says it's a duty for all of us to maintain our own lives. So again, we might disagree with him about whether or not that actually is an obligation, but just take it for a moment as a given that it is an obligation, because that helps to make the example work, okay? So if it's a duty for us all to maintain our lives, okay, Kant notes that it's also something that we have a direct inclination to do most of the time, okay? So most of us want to go on living, right? I mean, it's not that hard to be convinced that, you know, you should go on living. Most people just want to go on living, right? But now imagine that there's a person who is suffering from terrible medical conditions, or they've suffered tremendous heartbreak and disappointment, and they see no point in life and they want to just give up. Okay, and they're very tempted to commit suicide because of how bad things have gotten. Kant says that if this person keeps themselves alive, not because they want to be alive, but they keep themselves alive out of a sense of duty, then that is a case of someone acting from a concern for duty. And that's a case of a person manifesting the good will. Okay, so in this case, we would know for sure that the person's will was good because they were responding to their moral obligation, or a sense of their moral obligations, rather than just pursuing their inclinations. And that's what it's like to act out of a concern for duty, according to Kant. And that's also, that involves having a good will, according to Kant. Okay, so the basic point that Kant is making here about the relation between duty and inclination is one that he further makes with two other examples. One having to do with an obligation to be beneficent whenever one can, that is, to be charitable or philanthropic, to help those who are suffering. And then the second is an example of preserving one's own happiness. And here he talks, for instance, about a gouty patient, that is someone who's suffering from gout, which is an ailment of the legs usually, and it can be brought on by too much drinking. So this person decides that, yes, they're suffering a lot, and if they drink anymore, or walk anymore, run around town, for instance, they're basically creating more suffering for themselves in the future. They're getting in the way of their own happiness. But they say to themselves, hey, I can do what I like, and if I just want to have a good time today, then that's okay. I mean, I can have a great time today and suffer the consequences later. Okay, so in what he says about these two examples, he further clarifies this point about the relation between duty and inclination, which is an important step on his way to saying what the good will is like. Now, I've left you in your reading responses to basically clarify those points. So based on the background I've given you so far about Kant, hopefully you'll be able to read the text carefully, even though it is hard to read, and draw out those points from these examples.